So thanks for joining us for, I think, our last or second last.
No, last.
Last? Ooh, we're getting to the end of term. Saving the best for last. No pressure. A speaker in the seminar series. It's nice to have a full house. Jessica Davis, who's one of our PhD students, but also the president of Insight Threat Intelligence, will be giving a talk based on the research she's doing for her dissertation. Her dissertation, as part of which led to her winning the very prestigious Sharks Talent Award this year. So again, no pressure. It better be good.
No. All right. Thanks, Leah, and thanks everyone for having me. I have to say I'm a little bit nervous. I haven't presented on my research, but I've got both of my supervisors in the room, and I'm presenting them stuff they haven't seen yet. So this is a bold choice, I think. So I think I've got about 30 to 45 minutes worth of content, and then we should have enough time for questions. Hold them to the end if you can. If anything's really not clear, jump in and we'll clarify it, but otherwise, let's do this. So first of all, let's talk about why preventing terrorist financing matters. Every year, terrorist attacks kill thousands of people around the world. But have you ever stopped to wonder how the terrorists acquired the weapons, devices, and components that they use for those attacks? All of that comes from their financial resources. Without money, terrorists really have no ability to conduct large-scale, spectacular, high-casualty attacks. Some examples that are up on the screen: 9/11 cost about $800,000. You might think hijacking a plane would be cheap, right? But there's all the training and planning and preparation that goes into it that adds to those costs. The Utøya attacks in Norway cost about $97,000. The Bataclan was $110,000. The Nice attack, which was just a simple truck attack, quote unquote, was $36,000. Even a recent attack here in Canada, the Sandwich Bank robbery, the attackers acquired about $12,000 worth of weaponry before they actually conducted their attack, even though it was basically like a lone actor, spontaneous attack. So the idea here is that if you stop the flow of funds or reduce the amount of money that terrorists have access to, you can not prevent all terrorism, but maybe make that terrorism less lethal, less spectacular, less impactful. To start with, the first problem that I encountered in the literature is that basically no one's defining counter-terrorist financing in the same way. I'm doing a series of interviews, and the first question that I ask a lot of my experts is, what is counter-terrorist financing? And the variety of answers that I get are absolutely astonishing. So the first piece of research that I did as part of the directed readings that I did in my first year was to really identify what counter-terrorist financing policies and practices are. So the first one is criminalization. So it's creating new offenses in law that enable investigations. A number of countries around the world also have legislation that allow victims of terrorism to sue financiers of terrorism. There's also kinetic counter-terrorist financing. This is the capture, kill, destroy mission. We saw a lot of it in the Islamic State, where big cash storage sites were targeted, Islamic State financiers were targeted. We've also got financial intelligence, which is using intelligence derived from financial information to eliminate networks, to identify procurement activity, all of those kinds of things. And we've got sanctions. So how we exclude terrorists from the financial system. Canada obviously has a sanctioning regime. There's one through the United Nations, and most countries have some sort of domestic legislation for this. We've also got financial deplatforming. So we see this in a lot of extreme right or ideologically motivated violent extremists these days, where they're not necessarily breaking the law. So the first couple of ones don't apply, but we want to get them off platforms. So there's like activists and even governments that will approach platforms that are providing payment services or payment opportunities and get them kicked off those platforms. And then the last two are things like private sector engagement through mandatory reporting. So all banks have to report financial reports to our financial intelligence unit. That helps detect the flow of funds in theory for terrorist financing and public-private partnerships. And then of course, policy diffusion, which is the diffusion of international standards, often through, I would say, coercion to different states. So these are all the things that we do. This is the bucket of counter-terrorist financing policies and practices. But the question is, what do they do? We have no idea. There's no empirical evidence that any of those things work or don't work. So that's really the fundamental thing that I'm getting at here. But the impact of failing to meet those international standards that I talked about earlier are really bad for countries. You'll get blacklisted, you could get sanctioned. Correspondent banks might shut down their relationships, so it makes it harder for you and your citizens to move money around internationally. So there are real impacts to not meeting those standards. There's also a lot of unintended consequences of counter-terrorist financing policies and practices. Obviously, privacy is a huge one, human rights, impacts on civil society, like the charitable sector. One really good example is in Russia. Russia is actually one of the most effective, according to the Financial Action Task Force, jurisdictions for countering terrorist financing and anti-money laundering. But Russia has also used that same effectiveness to target civil society, and Navalny and his organization, which was declared a terrorist organization, and all financing to that organization was deemed to be a criminal offense. So there's lots of unintended consequences, and in some cases, just misuse of counter-terrorist financing policies and practices. So really, more than 20 years after the terrorist attacks of September 11th, it's time to evaluate global counter-terrorist financing policies and practices, because these really emerge from that global war on terrorism framework, assess the utility of approaches where we can, and determine whether they actually reduce levels and intensity of terrorism. So the state of the literature, this is what Professor Carvin has not seen yet, but she wanted it in my dissertation, so that's good. So I've looked at about over 600 articles, books, and reports. There's a lot of gray literature in this field. So like think tanks doing a lot of good and less good work. So it's a bit of a mixed bag, but it's really under theorized. And there's lots of literature, but only a few contributions. Methods are largely non-existent. A lot of the material is really descriptive in nature, a lot of legal analysis about like whether the laws are compliant with different things, but that doesn't get to the question that I'm asking, right? Some of the theories that you see in the literature are deterrence theory, but again, like not really developed in terms of a theory, but just kind of thrown in there as like a word that we're using, collective action. And the one that I think is the most interesting, which is what we can infer from the policy debate. And that's sort of where my theory comes from and sort of what my interviews with experts are getting at. And then this is just some of the main themes in counter-terrorist financing, law and regulations, critiques, charities. There's a lot of different topics, but there's not a lot of depth to this. So the problem and puzzle that I'm really looking at here is, since 9/11, countering the financing of terrorism has been a key component of the global war on terrorism, but we're not clear what it's meant to do. And actually, terrorism and terrorist attacks, numbers of terrorist attacks are actually increasing over time. So the question is, like, what do counterterrorism practices in general do, and what do specifically counter-terrorist financing practices do? We've also seen a shift in tactics to some lone actor, small cell attacks, but it's not universal, right? Like October 7th demonstrates those big spectacular attacks still happen. So the research question here is, what effect, if any, have CTF policies and practices had on terrorism? And the answer that I put forward, and we're going to talk about mostly today, is where they're implemented, and that's sort of like a big asterisk, I think. Counter-terrorist financing policies and practices force terrorist adaptation to fewer and lower cost and lower complexity attacks. So we're not saying that there's less terrorism because of that, it's that their tactics are really changing and the way that they're going about conducting terrorism is changing. But implementation matters. And without adequate resources and effort, the effects of counterterrorism financing will be muted. And I think this is important. The other thing that I think is important about counterterrorist financing is we did talk about like some of the unintended consequences of it, but it's still a softer form of counterterrorism than like the kinetic side of things, the arbitrary detentions that we see as sort of like a lot of counterterrorism policy. So I think it's a really valuable tool. We just need to get much more nuanced about it. So the theoretical framework. So much of the terrorism literature draws from, like it really spans a bunch of different disciplines. So we've got sociology, criminology, political science, all of this, a lot of psychology in the terrorism literature. So it's trying to explain the social aspects of terrorism. So they're the motivations, the radicalization piece. And some of the literature tries to explain the social aspects in terrorism in economic terms, which is kind of interesting, like looking at terrorists as rational actors and sort of how that plays into our counterterrorism approaches. But few studies have used both economics to model that social and economic behavior in terrorism. And in counter-terrorist financing, because we've got both sort of economic and financial concepts that we're talking about and the social context, I've decided to bring these two things together to better explain the changes in behavior that we can maybe observe through counter-terrorist financing policies. This is some of the images I created here through OpenAI's DALL-E. Could not do a Venn diagram to save its life yesterday, so I had to like separate it out and do it for it. There's some ones that I think are kind of fun though that I'll show you later. So the piece here is that terrorists are rational actors. And this is not something, like we can debate that, but I am firm in my view that terrorists are rational actors. It just depends on like what kind of rationality we're talking about. And terrorists get utility from attacks. They consume some combination of normal goods and terrorist goods. So I call that guns and butter. So the normal goods here, whoever's are on here on their axis. Oh, this doesn't showing up here, but and they have a budget constraint. So they can't just go and buy all of the guns and butter that they want. They have to make choices like the rest of us. Terrorist attacks themselves cost money. So the idea here is that reducing the amount of money that terrorists have forces them to consume less terrorism. So you see that shift from T to T prime and N to N prime. And so CTF policies and practices reduce funds available to terrorists and or make terrorist attacks more costly. So the policies maybe affect the sort of the revenue side and sort of create entire constraints on the entire budget, or they affect the price side by making the attacks themselves more pricey. What we then see is a substitution of cheaper targets and tactics, lower complexity and lower casualty attacks. We can also think about this as a supply and demand problem. So demand for terrorism is driven by things like grievances, radicalization processes, and other social and psychological factors. So that's the demand side of terrorism. The supply side, though, is really driven by things like price of attacks, cost of components, devices, weapons, operational security, and both normal and terrorist goods. A lot of our counterterrorism policies have actually tried to address the demand side. So there are counter-radicalization policies, those kinds of things. I think in a lot of ways, we've actually kind of ignored the supply side, or we've not been as good at the supply side as we think we've been on the demand side, which is kind of an interesting way to think about this. So counterterrorism here limits the supply of terrorist attacks by making them more costly or reducing a group's resources, which I think we've talked about already. And this isn't a unique idea for me. I think Sandler wrote about this just last year. He's written about it before, but he really brought it to the forefront in a terrorism and political violence article that was just published. But it's sort of speckled throughout the literature. So it's what I'm doing here is I'm trying to pull that and pull it and bring it to the forefront of counterterrorism financing theories. And then heavy-handed counterterrorism measures can actually increase supporters' demand for terrorist attacks. So instead of moving your demand from D to D prime, it actually creates more demand. So the example that I have in my Turkey case study is before, like in the mid to late 90s and 2010s, Turkey actually adopted more of a conciliatory policy towards the Kurds. And so they were actually able to shift the demand down, creating less demand and then fewer attacks in that. But it's not a study. Turkey case study, yeah. So the hypotheses for the study are as follows. If a country enacts counter-terrorist financing practices, there'll be a decrease in the number of attacks. So that's my sort of baseline. And what that we also see then is a decrease in casualties and lethalities, a shift or an increase to soft targets, a decrease in cost of attacks, decrease in complexity, and a decrease in external funding. And that happens through a decrease in the supply of terrorists and terrorist financing, so it's supply effect, a decreased provision of funds for terrorism, and an increased price of attacks by affecting the conditions of production of terrorism. So that's sort of how I'm mapping out the process. The methods that I'm using, it's really mixed here. So I've got a large N and 3 case studies. The quantitative study looked at the effects of counter-terrorist financing legislation on terrorism. So when states actually criminalize terrorist financing, what happens to the levels of terrorism in their country? Surprisingly, we found that across all models and measures of terrorism, implementing domestic counter-terrorist financing legislation is associated with a reduction in terrorism, which I actually found very confusing and surprising. I did not I mean, I don't know if you guys know, but I've worked in this field for a really long time. And so I'm very skeptical about some of the policies and practices that we do. So this finding was not what I expected. I would have actually expected almost like a nil result. So it really raises the question, okay, but what's happening behind the scenes? Like what's actually going on that's giving us this effect?
Mhm.
Which is where the case studies come in. So I chose 3, Canada, Turkey, and Sri Lanka. And there's a logic to this. I'm not sure if everyone remembers, but Canada has actually been a source country for the financing of PKK terrorism and LTTE terrorism. And in fact, like for the LTTE is possibly one of the most important countries, and the PKK was really important in the 90s, 2000s, and that shifted to Europe. So it's been like quite an important country for terrorist financing, but we don't talk about that, right? Because it's awkward. And then the Canada case study is really looking at our domestic terrorism issues, but across the ideological spectrum. And then also what we're doing in terms of listing and preventing the flow of funds to other countries. So I've got 2 case studies that we can look at today. I think we're okay for time. We'll do the Canada one for sure. Yeah. So the variables that I'm looking at in the case studies, some of these come from the quantitative study. So I've got terrorism, which is attacks, casualty, injuries, all from 2 different data sources, which is GTD and iterate. So I've got a bit of robustness there. And arrests and prosecutions. This comes from like, so this is where the data starts to get a little messy immediately. Interviews and government documents, because states do not publish their numbers of terrorism prosecutions and arrests, and if they do so, they are not consistent about it. So the numbers will change randomly from year to year with no explanation. And then target type, cost of attack, complexity, and funding source are all being derived from the GTD. Those don't exist in the GTD, so I'm coding that information in. Yeah, yes.
Can you explain what the GTD is?
Global Terrorism Database, data set, I think database, and it's run by START, a consortium of researchers. It's one of the, I guess it's the best terrorism database in the world. There's lots of problems with it, 1993 being one of the issues. Apparently a whole bunch, like all of that data just like literally fell off the back of a truck. You have to go in and add it. Yeah, it's a whole thing. Lots of problems with the data. It's the best we have. But going in and looking at every single attack individually, so I can get these cost complexity things coded properly, also gives us a level of comfort with the data. I wouldn't say certainty because it's sort of beyond the scope to go and find all of them, make sure that they've got all the terrorist attacks in there, but you'll sort of see some of the results. And then investigative resources. So like how many counterterrorism investigators are countries assigning? Again, not public information. So that's being derived from interviews, government documents, sometimes by Financial Action Task Force. The mutual evaluation reports will publish some of that. I've also read through for the 3 case studies, every one of their Financial Intelligence Unit annual reports. For Canada, I managed to get some access to information requests. So there's a whole, for Canada, I've also gotten some archival data. And then regulatory qualities coming in from the World Bank data, financial exclusion practices are coming in from the same sources that I talked about. And then legislation, it's the signing of the UN Convention. And then I can go into each country and tell you exactly when that happens. So that's the data, talk about how I'm operationalizing it there. And the results. So for Canada, we've had 2 terrorism financing arrests. Well, sorry, prosecutions, 1 extradition and 1 prosecution for financial facilitation. So great results, right? But a lot of our other sort of terrorism issues in Canada have had a financial component. One of them is like the Toronto 18 plot that I did a big piece of work with Professor Carvin, Professor West as well. And so there's lots of, the finance stuff is not necessarily front and center in our prosecutions, but it's woven into our overall approach to counterterrorism. So it's a bit, you have to pull it out a little bit. We also use immigration measures to counter the financing of terrorism. So deportations, extraditions, entry refusals, sometimes for specifically financing terrorism. That was big on the LTTE side, but also in the PKK case as well. So this is something that I looked at. So this is data that I derived from every single FinTrack annual report. And this is where, again, the data gets messy. So FinTrack, Canada's Financial Intelligence Unit, is actually really good at this. Probably some of the best in the world in terms of reporting. This tells us how many disclosure packages they've provided to law enforcement and their other disclosure partners about terrorist financing over the last, well, since the agency came into existence, so since 2002. There are still tons of problems in their data. I was really lucky though, because I know their public affairs officer, so I was able to get old versions of the reports, but they were never able to answer some of the questions that I had about why the numbers randomly changed from year to year. So there's, it's not a huge issue in this one, but it becomes a much bigger problem for other countries that just don't have the same reliability of data and where I don't have the same level of access to get clarification on the data that I do see. So financial intelligence in Canada is probably being used about 10% of the capacity of what it could be used for, according to my some of my interviews. Right, this is not, there we go. So we're creating lots of financial intelligence, but the use of it is a bit debatable. Investigators, again, this really depends on what time frame we're talking about. We have between 1 and 10 full-time terrorist financing investigators, but a lot of it now is that the terrorist financing investigators are now co-located within the INSETs, so they're part of other counterterrorism investigations. So at no point in time really do we have any full-time investigators anymore on terrorist financing, because they're all integrated and doing other things. And as soon as you have a threat to life investigation, everybody's pulled off to do that and nobody's doing the financing anymore, according to my interviewers, to interview subjects, which is pretty interesting. And then for sanctions, financial exclusion, we've got listings, debanking, oversights of charities, as some of the measures that are happening. And our regulatory quality, according to World Bank data, is improving over time. So this is the problem though. The number of terrorist attacks in Canada is actually increasing slightly over time. Now, look at the numbers on the scale. Like, this is very, very small numbers of attacks. This is not anywhere near compared to like Sri Lanka or Turkey. But what we're seeing is that they are becoming less lethal. And I think this, you probably see this anecdotally from some of the material that you would have consumed, like, lone actor attacks, vehicle rammings. We're not looking at big bomb plots as much anymore in Canada. So that's sort of what we see. And then cost has slightly decreased, but all attacks over time have really been low cost. So we're not talking, in Canada, we haven't seen plots that have been externally financed by, big terrorist groups. And that's sort of consistent across the board. A slight decrease in complexity. And again, that substitution to soft targets. The case studies that I would point there to is, things like, instead of the Toronto 18 bomb plot, we're seeing things like the London truck attack. So, really big difference in the complexity there. Outcome though is still pretty lethal. So in terms of evaluating the hypotheses, so really what we're seeing here, if we're enacting CTF policies, then it's a decrease in the number of terrorist attacks. That hypothesis is not supported in the Canada case study. And the number of people killed and injured in terrorist attacks has not gone down either. So lethality and casualties are still sort of increasing, even though we are doing CTF. But what we do see is a decrease in lethality, a decrease in the cost, subtle, very subtle changes. And I still have some tests to do, certain ones I have not forgotten, and a decrease in the complexity, no change in the external funding sources, and that shift towards softer targets. So then like what I'm showing you here is just like, and then my explanation for how that's happening and sort of trying to tease out the mechanisms of what's going on there. Let's go through Turkey, a little bit less developed than the Canada case study, and I don't have the Sri Lanka data to show you yet either. I'm still like in the weeds coding all of that, which is horrifying, as you can probably imagine. So terrorist financing in Turkey is a really different story. So they've had 77 terrorist financing convictions only related to the PKK. They say that they've had 4,478 terrorist financing files investigated, an increasing number of investigators. I would put an asterisk there next to investigations though, because I get the distinct impression from the research that I've done and the people that I've spoken to, that they consider a desk investigation to be the same as like a field investigation. So in Canada, we would make a distinction, like if somebody's just doing research, that's not a full-fledged investigation. That's just sort of background, data collection, whatever. In Turkey, I think they're putting it all together. harder to disaggregate what's actually happening. This is a great quote that I got from one of my interview subjects, explaining how Turkey approaches counter-terrorist financing. So he's saying, when I was in government, we're sometimes presented with regional bank account numbers of German citizens, but there wasn't the demand to close the bank account. So the Turkish authorities were coming to them and saying, we've got these bank accounts that we know are PKK bank accounts, but there was no request to close them. It was just more about, aha, we got you. You're the ones financing PKK terrorism. Don't talk to us about this. It was really like quite an interesting dynamic. So they didn't actually want the Germans to take action, but they just wanted them to know that they knew. Which explains a lot of things that we're going to see in the Turkey case study. So the financial intelligence use. The numbers look promising if you read all of their annual reports, but they are back on Financial Action Task Force gray list, specifically for some of their deficiencies in counter-terrorist financing. So what ends up happening is that in the annual reports and mutual evaluation, countries will come forward and say, we completed 100 terrorist financing investigations. We are one of the most effective jurisdictions for investigating this. But there's no way to check those numbers, and there's no way to figure out if these were legitimate charges and prosecutions. And Turkey is a really interesting place right now. And then they limit, to a limited extent, they use freeze and seize. And this is where I think some of the international efforts might be more impactful. So I've got a whole list of when every country in the world has actually listed the PKK as a terrorist organization. And then we can map that against some of the effects that we're seeing in terms of terrorist attacks. And I just want to say too, like Turkey is one of these jurisdictions that uses counter-terrorist financing against its political opponents. So, when they say broad strokes that they've completed 7,000 terrorist financing investigations, well, how many of them were against like the Gulen organizations? And so you have to really look at that data quite carefully. One of the reasons why I'm limiting what I'm looking at for each country to specific terrorist organizations, because if you take the aggregate, you'll spend all day trying to pick out what's legitimate and what's not. And their regulatory quality is decreasing over time. Again, government issues, coups, all that kind of stuff play a role. So Turkey. So the terrorist attacks in Turkey are actually increasing, and a lot after 2001, and they are increasing in lethality. There's no change in the cost, no change in the complexity, no change in the target type, no change in funding sources. But we just saw that Turkey's got all these great numbers, right? So the lack of variation here raises questions about what exactly their counter-terrorist financing measures are doing, and if they're even being implemented. So that was the end of the case studies. I'll just go through 2 more slides. What's the impact of this research on the field? So what I'm really hoping for here is that this is giving us a better way of measuring changes and impacts and outcomes of counter-terrorist financing policies and practices. Ideally, I'd like to see that bucket of activities that we're doing under CTF become a little more refined, a little more precise, reduce those unintended consequences, which is sort of a long-term policy project, but that's where I hope this research will support. And can we use our counterterrorism policies to nudge terrorists into choosing less harmful options? So really, a lot of what this seems to be doing is sort of pushing terrorists out of the complex space into the simple space, which I think broad strokes is useful, maybe makes it harder from an investigative perspective. Helps identify which policies might be the most effective, harmful, where we should be spending our money and energy. And then of course, just because the numbers look good doesn't mean implementation is going well. And then there's some preliminary support for the idea that if you affect the supply of terrorist goods and prices, and there's an effect on attacks. And I think the case studies and everything are really interesting for this research, but I also think that one of the contributions here is really just making it much more concrete what we're talking about in terms of counter-terrorist financing, because it's really hard to measure things if you don't know what you're talking about. And it's really hard to advance the field of study if we're not being really precise about what we're talking about. So I think that's really helpful. And that's one of the things that I'm enjoying making a contribution on. And then in terms of future research, I just want to say that I really love this dolly image of my guns and butter, because it's forcing the choice between that for terrorists. I really think that there's lots more case studies here to refine and test the theory. there's, I think if you looked at all the Five Eyes countries and a lot of European and even like lots of, in Africa, you'd see really different things across the board that can really help refine what we're looking at and look at those policies and practices a bit more. And then I actually think this is really interesting too, the expansion of economic approach to change terrorist behavior and other aspects of counterterrorism. So we've started to see like a little smidge of literature on this coming out. None of it's particularly good yet, but I think that there is some utility in thinking about terrorism as a supply and demand problem instead of just focusing on radicalization. And combining, like there's been so much work done on radicalization, social, psychological terrorism stuff with more of this supply side analysis. I think that there's a real future for that. And then I feel bolstered by that in my view by something that John Horgan just wrote recently. He's a big guy on the psychology of terrorism, like really, really great. He actually thinks that he's moving away from that now. So trying to predict who becomes involved with terrorism might be impossible, but asking how people become involved, what the different pathways to involvement look like, how recruiters operate, how terrorists perform acts. So like, to me, that's all of those pieces that we're talking about and how they experience it. Those kinds of questions lead to actionable knowledge. So that's where we're at right now. So I think we've got lots of type of questions.
Yeah. Teddy?
Just a simple one.
Yeah,
Do you have the data on how much money FinTrack spends every?
I think it's publicly available, but I don't have it on the top of my head.
And is it correlated with how many disclosures they find?
Oh, interesting. No. Well, I will say that I can definitely figure that out. The problem though, is that their disclosure numbers are a bit misleading because they'll count a disclosure. So a disclosure package, you might have 5 transactions in it. If they add another transaction and send it to another partner, that's a whole new disclosure. So the numbers are a little fuzzy. And so I would be a little wary of that, but.
Because I've always been interested in finding out how efficient they are. It's not related to resources, because I remember tracking this for a while in the early years.
Yeah.
And every year the numbers just kept going up and up and up. And I was thinking, okay, they're just putting more money, more people, and they're finding more, right? So does that mean that if you're not spending enough, you're not finding anything, but there may be more and we just don't know?
Right. The numbers actually go down in the last 3 years.
Which is why I was asking, because
Yeah.
when I was tracking, it was doing this.
Yeah.
And
There's
now it's gone.
obviously a COVID effect that's happening there because they were working on a reduced staff for I think 2 years. So that's, I asked them, I'm like, why are your numbers down? But then there's a sustained decrease beyond that. Like even after they go back to the office, we have like a full year of data and it's not recovered to the original numbers, which is kind of interesting. So I don't know, worth looking into though.
And follow up with, is there? No, this is probably not, but does FinTrack seek answers from its partners on how many of its reports actually get actioned to a point of view like a desk investigation?
They ask. No, they don't ask. If you read their annual reports, they include feedback from their partners. That feedback is always positive. Sometimes it's very muted in its positivity, but they're obviously cherry picking stuff that's really good. Some of the people that I interviewed talked about the inutility of FinTrack disclosures and how they would get them. They would look at it and say, that's great, and then just put it to the side. So.
Fun, yeah, it is them not.
Part of them, it's not knowing how to use it. Part of it is, FinTrack disclosures are complex, the way that they're presented. And I think a lot of investigators have just not been interested in figuring out how to make that useful. Professor Carmen.
Hey, so one of the things and obviously I like this research because we're hanging out on it, but one of the future challenges I wonder if you're gonna have is from ideologically motivated violent extremism. And even now, like if you look at the service and you look at their public reports, they say that since 2014, I think they've said 25 people have died, and it may be 27 now, but like have died in, it is 27, isn't it? Yeah. Have died in violent extremist attacks. But that goes back to looking at things that we did not consider terrorism at the time, which almost certainly should have been, like the New Brunswick shooting, right? And yeah, and all these kinds of things, right? And where like, you know, where charges haven't been laid. So I'm wondering, do you think that would affect your data and affect your research? Or like, I'm even thinking like a disruptive plot, like the Halifax mall shooting, where like Lindsay Supina, I think her name was, who's an American who flew to Halifax. There's obviously, I don't know where she got the money to do that from, but flew to, I don't know, it was because the guy was in love with her or something and they were gonna go blow something up in the mall. And then they got disrupted, but at the time it was, oh no, that's not terrorism. I'm like,
It was a domestic thing, right?
they were in love. They just wanted to kill a bunch of people in a mall because she's a white nationalist, you know, far right nationalist.
Terrorism, it's fine.
Yeah, it's great. So I'm just wondering, do you think that would shift your results in any way? Or as we move to these kind of far right plots, which seem to be maybe a little bit more basic in nature?
So what I would say to that, so that data is obviously in my Canada case study.
Oh, even
Even
the,
the IMBE stuff, yeah.
oh, yeah,
All
okay.
that is in. But what I think is happening here, and I can't quite prove it, is that the IMBE actors
Mhm.
have actually made that adaptation. So they're not trying to conduct high complexity attacks because they know that they're gonna get disrupted, or they suspect that they will get disrupted.
They already don't trust the state.
Yeah, and there's a whole bunch of things that are happening there. So that's my intuition that I can't prove. Professor Rollins?
So welcome to the dark side of economics.
Yeah.
Why, some more for you to think about. But when I go back to Josh Kilber's dissertation, question of what kind of terrorist organizations are likely to be affected by this.
Yeah.
comes to mind. So if you're in a big, centralized, large, bureaucratic organization, you're probably a fairly easy target and you need a lot of resources. So you'd expect a deflection towards the kind of very loose, it's like lone actor or very diffuse, very non-centralized organization, his market structures. So do you detect that at all, do you think, or is it possible to detect the kinds of organizational structures being affected?
I think it is. I think not in this data. I think, to get at that, you'd want to basically apply this framework to groups instead of countries within groups within countries. But, we'd look at more like Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, things that are less based in one area and sort of come at it from a different lens, which is a bigger project. But I think there's something that we could do there.
It's a little counterintuitive that, the operations in Canada tend to be like really, really small scale individuals. PKK, LTTE, these are like huge organizations, which presumably would be like pretty big targets.
I think Professor Dunley had a question first.
I have a few points. The first one is that I'm struck by how cheap terrorism is. Your example, see, I do some work on contract killing and I was stunned by how much the Indians paid to get the Sikh nationalist activists killed.
How much was it?
150,000.
It's over 100,000.
Yeah, something like
US.
that.
One person.
Exactly.
4 people?
That were targeted.
But it was 100,000.
Oh, yeah, no, I think it was 300 for 4, but see, I'm thinking of my.
It's a read one. Right.
My Brazilian contract killers charge 1,500 for a judge.
Yeah.
And do rapists for free. So my point is, I find this remarkably low priced. Okay, so given that, you get a gun.
Yeah.
You just get a gun. See, I was thinking Polytechnique. I don't know if it's in the list of terrorist attack, but it would be classified as terrorist attack today. They would have this gun. So maybe bullets. See, so I'm wondering again, this goes a bit along the line of Dane, for whom? So that was my first point. My second point is counterfactuals. What would have happened without counter-terrorist financing laws? Because that's basically, because maybe we would all be dead without those laws. So what's the baseline?
Please stop bringing that.
Third one is the issue of supply and demand. I was trying to, you say about the supply, you said hardline repression increases demand for terrorism. Okay, arguably, yes, possibly. But don't you think that it would have an impact on supply too? So, see, so the measurement there becomes a bit,
Yeah, it's sort of like a moves back and then, yeah.
exactly. I'll stop there.
Can I just have a follow-up question on the counterfactual? How could I include something like that in my research? Or like, how could I explore a counterfactual?
You'd have to find some kind of baseline or to imagine to construct one. But see, there are techniques, synthetic counterfactual, but you could do it perhaps with big groups and perhaps with one of your cases. But I mean, I do qualitative. So, but the main thing is to keep it in the back of your mind. Okay, when you ask questions and try to see anomalies or things that could be explained by other factors. And just a sub note on this, when you say there's an increase, the increases that you document for Canada and Turkey are mostly driven by 1 year stat.
Yeah.
So again, see, it's not clear.
Yeah.
So what I was thinking is just what would it have been without that?
Okay.
But
that just general trend of increasing incidence, is that controlled for population size at all? Growth, population growth?
No, it's not controlled for population growth.
And kind of a vague question, but how does crypto have anything to do with what you just talked about?
I love this question.
I cannot do anything on terrorist financing without being asked about crypto. I mean, I guess crypto in terrorist financing and counter-terrorist financing is everywhere now. Like it's now fully integrated into our counterterrorism financing policies. It's part of the Financial Action Task Force recommendations. So to that extent, for this project, it's sort of as of about 2018, this was sort of integrated into our analysis. But there's a lot of really interesting adaptations that we're seeing in the terrorist financing space, and what do I say? How do you say it? It's experimentation by terrorist groups into crypto, even though they haven't necessarily got like the infrastructure set up for it. Like there was recently a report that came out that said that a lot of the terrorist groups in Africa are now experimenting with crypto, possibly as an adaptation against counter-terrorist financing practices. But I think in a lot of cases not, because, you know, in countries like Nigeria, CTF is really not happening per se, but maybe it's like an adaptation in expectation of there being CTF pressures at some point in time, or like the rest of us, maybe they just think it's cool and they want to like get on the latest technology. So there's a lot of really interesting things in that space.
Well, is there any connection between like hype, crypto hype,
Yes.
and your propensity to being radicalized? Like are those things?
In the
I
IMB,
love that question.
yeah, this is, I would say that there is a Venn diagram between crypto bros and
Gender-based misogynists.
yeah, that's exactly it. The Venn diagram, and it's not a circle, but it's got more overlap rather than less. And for IMVE terrorists, we do tend to see a lot more interest, although every once in a while the interest will result in them not using it. So the Buffalo shooter is a really good example of this. So he thought about experimenting with crypto to raise money for his attack, but then ultimately decided that it was too like elaborate. It is still a little bit difficult to do, especially if you're going to use any sort of operational security measures. But then the Christchurch shooter raised about $6,500 through cryptocurrency speculation for his attack. So it is in that space.
He's very public, right? Like he broadcast what he was doing.
Christchurch?
Yeah. So I guess it depends on the flow.
But that stuff he wasn't really broadcasting at the time because that was all found as part of the investigation into what happened afterwards. So it was.
Can I ask a quick follow-up on this? So before crypto, there was Hawala and all the informal transfer systems.
Yeah.
Wouldn't that be the same?
It is the exact same.
So FinTrack does not disclose informal transactions, right? It's only what goes for the banking.
So.
For the financial
Well,
system.
Is technically a money service business. It's technically required to register with.
So the reporting that you have here comes, is
Should.
including that.
And part of their compliance outreach is to identify non-registered MSBs, which are HOLAs.
Yeah.
And get them to register and start reporting. But I think the most interesting thing that I've seen in my research is actually the mashup between cryptocurrency and hawaladars. So in Afghanistan and Syria, there are hawaladars who have cryptocurrency wallets, so then can facilitate transactions on the blockchain and then pay it out in local currencies. And it's just a diversification of the services that they offer. Really fascinating stuff that is.
But FinTrack doesn't have yet compliance for FinTrack.
Yes,
For crypto.
for crypto, if you are an exchange, you are a money service business in Canada. The exception to that, is wallet to wallet transactions. So if you have an unhosted wallet, like I have one on my phone, there's no touch points with the regulated system. I can send anybody else in this room money. If we have the same, yeah, I'll send you money. It's carbon. And there will be no record of that, except on the blockchain, but you'd only be able to identify that if you know me and Professor Carbon's wallet address.
So in your presentation, you compared the amount of prosecutions and basically financing that has been blocked towards, and then you compare it with Canada's terrorist attacks.
Yeah.
And all that. But a lot of the financing that comes from terrorist groups, especially in Canada, doesn't go towards Canadian terrorist attacks. And so it would be nice to see the correlation between, Canada's anti-financing terrorist laws and its effect on other countries, because it's not just the money being made in Canada goes towards terrorizing Canada. It goes, especially with the PKK, the Tamil Tigers, all sorts of group, it goes towards other countries. So sort of that relationship would be interesting to see.
Yeah, that's in the case studies for Sri Lanka and Turkey. There's other examples though too, like groups like Hezbollah, which is a bit harder to pull out, but I think is also really interesting. But yeah, I agree, like that's a big piece of it.
Have you seen correlation between union?
Yeah.
And
I think that there, again, tentative data at this point in time, but I think that Canada's listing of the LTTE actually had a measurable impact on the LTTE's finances and a consequential impact on the end of that war. It's a bit difficult to tease out because the Sri Lankan government was pursuing a very heavily kinetic policy at the time. So basically capture, kill as many terrorists as possible. But they were also struggling, the LTTE was also struggling to hit resupply and get all of the things that they needed to mount an effective opposition to that counteroffensive. So I think there's a little bit of support for that.
You mentioned sources of financing. How do you operationalize this? Is it state, non-state, in between, criminal organizations?
Yeah, it's state, internal, external. So it's really like, it's quite loose because the data's pretty loose on it. So if it's so it'd be like self-financing. So it just like I raise the money from my own personal resources. It could be from like a broader network, so an external source or a state source. And that's really all we have. It's just sort of like a 3-level operationalization. And we do it for I do it for every single terrorist attack, but again, it's a bit dicey.
Yeah, but a bit along the line of Nate's comment, perhaps if you play with your sample with size of organization, type of organizations, type of financing, perhaps you could find a target, because that was my fourth question. It has to do with the assumption that the relationship is relatively linear, and I wonder if you don't have a collapse at some point, or maybe that it's dependent on the type of group. Maybe you have different equations for each type of groups.
Yeah.
And then this would enable you to identify not just if, but under what conditions do what type of CTF have an impact.
And then Professor Rollins, that ties into your request for me to elaborate more on the Canada case study qualitatively, right? That's, just want to make sure I'm hearing the same thing there. It's great.
But not just Canada, you can do it with every territory.
Yeah.
Sources and type.
In your like operationalization, like in that table, you have a lot of like scales from like 0 to 4 for like complexity or like
Mhm.
funding sources from 0 to 10. Like, how do you come up with that scale? Like, do you justify it yourself or?
Yeah, there's a whole method section in which I talk through like how I'm developing the scale, but it is fairly arbitrary, like it's just. We're developing a scale, here it is, so. There's no external, nobody else has done anything similar except for the complexity. Complexity, I was able to rely on another piece of work to do that, and I just made like one little adaptation to that scale, which is why it's like 1 to 11 or 1 to 10.
But how would you like find that, like, in terms of like making it sound more credible? When it comes to like your.
I use big words to make it sound more credible. No, I just, so part of what I did is sort of preliminary work for this was I looked at, I think it was 30 or 40 different terrorist attacks and analyzed the financing behind them. And then I used that to sort of create the scale, sort of create categories. I coded a lot of it in vivo to sort of say, like, get a sense of how much we're talking about and the levels of complexity that way. So that's the way that I did it.
Only asking as I personally hate doing scales because it opens up to a lot of questioning.
Yeah, you gotta start somewhere though, right? Yeah. So somebody else might want a 15-point scale.
Yeah.
A lot of the time, we don't have sufficient data to create that level of granularity though, so.
Yeah, I just want to clarify before when you're talking about Turkey's 3K plus like reported investigations and then they came in Germany. So that was an example of Turkey like poking Germany in the eye a little bit.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So instead of tackling, because Turkey comes under a lot of international pressure for not dealing with its own terrorist financing problem. And so they sort of turned the tables on Germany. I think the Germans were just like, well, this is actually more of a domestic intelligence problem because you're now stealing German citizens' bank accounts. So it became a very funny conversation.
Just curious, you mentioned about like the impact on investigations,
Mhm.
potentially substituting away from or towards
yeah.
like simple attacks. What are you hearing from the people that you're interviewing about? Because even if you could potentially move to a system in which there's more attacks, they're less lethal individually, but the overall lethality is still, especially when we're talking about like IMB.
Yeah, and that's really what we're seeing in Canada. And so what I'm hearing from people that I've been interviewing is, well, let me give you my sort of analysis of it, and I can tell you specifically what they've said. I've lost my train of thought. It's gone now. So substitution is definitely happening. Investigators say that it makes it harder. I think what's ended up happening though is that the counter-terrorist financing regime was really meant to target groups. Like it comes out of the war on terror, it comes out of the Al-Qaeda model. And so everything that was originally established for counter-terrorist financing was group, like had a group lens on it. There's been adaptations and adjustments and evolution of that over time, but I think a lot of investigative mindset is still, well, if it's just one guy, we can't do anything because he's not part of a network, so we have no means to detect him and disrupt him, which I don't actually accept as an investigative problem. I think that's more of a mindset problem and maybe a leads problem.
Yeah, I was just thinking about, and you know a lot more about this than me, I'm just, but like the visibility of certain preparations for attacks versus like if we look at something like development or you know, you gave some examples where they're relatively low tech or like attacks that would be incredibly hard to, like the source of funds could even be, it's like they might have that in their bank account already.
Absolutely. And I think this is where it becomes a difference between like where you're getting your lead information for your investigation. So in the Veltman case, how could we have known about the attack? Well, he was active on some forums, right? So if we're using that as like, there's not necessarily no leads, it's just that we need to figure out how we're going to exploit those leads and how we're going to do that within the law. And a lot of people, some people suggest that we need a law change to make it easier to surveil those folks, to get IP addresses and that kind of stuff.
Now we have to change the law.
Yeah. And yeah, but like within the context of an ongoing investigation, like if he had been under investigation and somebody had seen all of that stuff, it would have been like, I think they should have been flagged, like this is like he was acquiring a truck, he was posting on these forums and all that stuff.
And the last thing I'll say is, but when he was mentioning about like a synthetic bomb, we actually just read a paper on this in our econ class.
Yeah.
Basque, the ETA.
Yes.
You may have already seen it, but it was looking at how it affected terrorism, but.
I mean, this is like 5 years ago for me, but yes.
It's by Barros and BARROS and Jill Alana, GIL-ALANA. So maybe.
Thank you. I have forgotten the things I would have first here. Did you?
Yeah, no, so there's a PhD meeting, ironically, they organized it for the same time as our PhD award-winning student. We're almost done. But yeah, and so they didn't leave at a protest is what I just. No protest. I do have a question though, since the economists have largely left the room.
Yeah.
And I am not an
Is
economist.
this to be that PhD meeting?
Don't think so, why?
Okay.
No, it's just, they would have told you.
That's Phil's meeting.
That's Phil's meeting. Phil's running it.
If you have to go, just go.
No. I'm here.
They all went that way. Anyways, all that to say. Behavioral economics.
Yeah.
So. You sent me a message the other day, like behavioral economics. I was like, okay, I like behavioral economics because I really like the movie Moneyball.
Yeah.
Although I'm starting to really have concerns about Lewis's work.
Yeah.
But that's okay.
There's actually a lot of concerns about behavioral economics data across the board.
Across the board. So that being said, why have other people tried to approach this through a behavioral economics? So I have to think for economics, people have tried to look at terrorism through this lens. But like, have other people tried to look at this issue through behavioral economics? And what is it that you think adds to this? This is a very kind of PhD oral exam question, but I thought, why not now?
There are 2 studies that I've seen looking at behavioral economics and terrorism and counterterrorism specifically.
Right.
They're light.
They're meh.
They're meh. They're very mid.
Okay, very mid papers.
And then there's lots of other stuff in the economics literature that's sort of getting in that sort of space. So Sandler does a lot of work in that.
Right.
And so I've pulled as much of that as I can in, but none of it's in counter-terrorist financing. And
So
so
do you think there's a reason why people haven't looked at this before, or it's just because there's not, the literature is just so scattered anyways?
I think it's a literature issue and an interest, like it's really shocking the few people that have looked at it. I guess maybe it's not sexy, like it's not sexy like DRAD or.
It's sexy to us.
I think it's
That's
funny. How could it not be? But it's like the number of people that have looked at it, like I can't overstate how messy the literature is. Like if you look at the psychology of terrorism literature, there are synthetic reviews that sort of bring everything together in different spots. And so you can have like 2 or 3 different reviews that kind of find the same thing. They make arguments, they outline the overall theories. There is nothing in the terrorism financing, counter-terrorism financing literature like that, except for the article that I published in Terrorism and Political Violence. And so like, just field is not developed in that way. This is one of the things that I'm so excited about. Like, so even if I don't have any really interesting findings for this research, I'm like, I've done that. This is something that I've done and like, we can now move forward with. Because a lot of the work is really descriptive. Okay. Anything else?
Someone who used to read FinTrack reports as part of terrorism investigations.
Yeah.
The understanding and depth of knowledge and how it works and all of it is lacking.
Yeah.
So I think
100%. Yeah. 100%.
So I agree that we need some theorizing about how this actually works, rather than just creating policy in response to crisis.
Yeah, the problems that you see like with investigators is the same problems you kind of see in researchers and academics. It's like different problems, but the same overall problem. Yeah. Well, thanks a lot for,
One thing, I've never heard of FinTrack before because this is not my world.
welcome.
Yeah, it's kind of cool, actually. FinTrack, whoever, like the mandate of FinTrack or whoever and or who funds FinTrack, is that different? Or is there conflict between them and whoever FinTrack is trying to talk to you about like, this is what we know, you should probably do something about it? Is there,
There's,
what's going on there?
yeah, what's going on there? So the Government of Canada funds FinTrack. It's a separate agency. It's part of the overall counterterrorism strategy. It also regulates our financial sector, like banks and money service businesses. It's taken over a lot of that role from some of that role from OSFI. But the relationship between FinTrack compliance, so forcing them to do mandatory reports, and sort of the counterterrorism side of things is like a really interesting one because it's a bit of a carrot and a stick. So they need to be reporting suspicious transactions. And if they don't, they get fined. But then how do you, the banks, other financial institutions get fined for not doing that? Like there was recently like a $3 million fine against
TD or something, or
RBC is the next one. There's a whole bunch of them that are coming up. So it's like a carrot and stick relationship. And then the other thing that's really interesting about that, and this is a little bit inside baseball, is like a lot of FinTrack people end up going to work for banks. So like, what's the conflict of interest there and incentive structure? I think that's really interesting.
Isn't that just like a canonical problem of politics in general? Like you are regulator, you are now the thing being regulated, and they're two heads from the same beast.
Yeah. But there's like no cooling off period between being a FinTrack employee and going to work for a bank, which I think is kind of wild. You could say that it's problematic.
like violate the conflict of interest ethics rules of public servants, but
Are fines though in your work, to your mind, are fines a symptom of success, an indicator of success or failure?
For who?
Good question.
I think for banks and financial institutions, fines are a cost of doing business.
Yeah.
So their incentive is to keep their fines as low as possible.
Mm.
But the fines are never materially important to their bottom line.
No.
Like even in the US where you have 10 million.
$3 million is the cost of a condo in Toronto.
Like it's literally a rounding error on a quarterly statement from the bank. It's not even significant in terms of revenues, and certainly not in terms of profits.
Reputation.
There's a reputational risk, but you can make the argument that nobody cares.
all right.
Yeah.
Well, with that, thank you
Thank
very
you guys for
much.
coming. I really appreciate it. Pick the wheels of this.